country. Madam President, I ask my colleagues to support this legislation. And I yield.
Madam President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, may I first ask unanimous consent that for the duration of today's session, Varun Jain, who is a fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges.
Without objection.
Thank you. Tomorrow, Madam President, we will have the opportunity to deliver a little bit of tax certainty to the American people by advancing the Middle Class Tax Cut Act. This legislation would prevent tax rates from increasing for the vast majority of American families and would preserve an important tax credit that currently helps millions of students and families afford the costs of a higher education. This Middle Class Tax Cuts Act is the right thing to do for the middle class, and I intend to vote for it. The question is, will it be filibustered? A tax cut for millions of hardworking Americans, filibustered simply to protect the wealthiest Americans from paying a fair share. We will find out. This is not a new story. In 2001, when President George W. Bush decided to spend a large portion of the surpluses he inherited from President Clinton to cut tax rates across the board, many Democrats opposed it because the tax cuts were unfairly weighted towards the highest income Americans. As a result of this opposition, Republicans were forced to set the tax cuts to expire at the end of 2010. As 2010 drew to a close, President Obama and many Democrats in Congress, including myself, supported extending the tax cuts for middle-class families, but letting the lower rates on income above $200,000 for an individual and $250,000 for a family revert to the Clinton-era levels, as was scheduled. Senate Republicans filibustered that effort, refusing to allow the middle-class tax cut without a tax cut for America's wealthiest. Not wanting tax rates to go up on middle-class families still struggling during the recovery, the President and Senate Democrats reluctantly agreed to extend all of the tax cuts through this year, which brings us to now. Once again, these tax rates are set to expire. I would like to keep rates low for middle-class families. Those families in Rhode Island are still struggling in the aftermath of the mortgage meltdown on Wall Street. And this is not the time to raise their taxes. But I agree with President Obama that for reasons of fairness and to begin to address our deficit, it would be wise not to extend the Bush tax cuts for high levels of income. And bear in mind in this discussion that the Middle Class Tax Cut Act actually would benefit even high-end taxpayers. When we protect the rates for the first $250,000 in income, it's the first $250,000 for somebody making $1 million. It's not just the first $250,000 for a family that makes $100,000 or $185,000. If you make $100 or $185 million, you still get the first $250,000. If your family, for instance, makes $255,000, you'd only see an increase on the $5,000 and only to the Clinton-era rates that were in effect during the 1990s when our economy was thriving. A family earning $255,000 would pay an extra $150 as a result of this bill. Extending the lower tax rates for income above $250,000 for 1 year, again, as the Republicans have proposed, would add over $49 billion to our deficit. Even in Washington, $49 billion is significant money, money that would have to be borrowed, adding to our deficit problem. Now, many of the same Republicans who voted in the name of deficit reduction to end Medicare as we know it. Deficit reduction was so important to them that they voted in that Ryan budget to end Medicare as we know it, to put thousands of dollars in costs on our seniors. They would support deepening the deficit with high-end tax cuts. There's a double standard here, and for most Rhode Islanders, these are exactly the wrong priorities when it comes to deficit reduction. In addition to the deficit concerns, we should let the tax cuts at the top expire just for fairness reasons. Loopholes and special provisions allow many super high-income earners to pay lower tax rates than many middle-class families. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, 65% of individuals earning $1 million or more annually pay taxes at a lower rate than median income taxpayers making $100,000 or less. Let me say that again so it sinks in. 65%, two-thirds nearly, of individuals earning $1 million or more a year, the vast majority of individuals earning $1 million or more annually, pay taxes at a lower rate than median income taxpayers making $100,000 or less. Because of the loopholes, because of what the special interests have done, our supposedly progressive tax system is upside down to the point where 65% of over $1 million earners pay a lower tax rate than the median income taxpayer making $100,000 or less. As you know, Madam President, earlier this year we voted on my Paying a Fair Share Act, legislation that would implement the so-called Buffett rule and ensure that multi-million-dollar earners paid at least a 30% overall effective federal tax rate. During debate on my Buffett rule bill, I cited an IRS statistic that the top 400 taxpayers in America in 2008 who earned an average of $270 million apiece, they each earned on average $270 million in that 1 year, and they paid the same 18.2% effective tax rate on average that's paid by a truck driver in Providence, Rhode Island. The single biggest factor driving this inequality is the special low rate for capital gains, 15% under the Bush tax cuts. The special capital gains rate allows hedge fund billionaires to avail themselves of that so-called carried interest loophole and pay taxes at lower rates than their doormen, their secretaries, their chauffeurs. If we let the tax cuts at the top expire, these rates revert to 20% instead of 15%. Now, 20% is still a pretty low rate for someone making $100 million a year, but it's more like what a family making $100,000 a year pays. Let's also be very clear about one more thing. The proposal that Republicans prefer, the tax cut bill introduced by Finance Committee Ranking Member Orrin Hatch, would raise taxes. It would raise taxes on 25 million lower and middle income Americans. It would raise taxes on those 25 million Americans still struggling in these challenging economic times. Republicans claim not to want to raise taxes, but the Republican tax bill would let very popular lower and middle income provisions expire that would cost 25 million Americans an average of $1,000 each. Under the Republican bill, 12 million families would see an end to a smaller child tax credit. 6 million families would lose their earned income tax credit, and 11 million families would lose their American Opportunity Tax Credit, which helps pay for college, provides a $2,500 tax credit for higher education. That popular tax credit has already helped millions of students and their parents pay for college, along with Pell Grants, another subject of Republican attack. Extending the American Opportunity Credit, the college tax credit, through 2013 would cost about $3.2 billion. So Republicans believe that we cannot afford a $3.2 billion investment in higher education for middle-class Americans, but we can afford $49 billion in continued tax cuts for ultra-high income earners. A $2,500 tax credit might seem pretty small in comparison to the $92,000 average tax break that millionaires, people earning $1 million a year, would receive from another year of high-end tax cuts. But that $2,500 may make a much bigger difference in the life of that middle-class family with that child trying to get into a college they can afford than that $92,000 would make in the life of somebody earning well over $1 million a year. Once again, Madam President, look at the priorities here. Republicans fought to protect the tax loopholes and taxpayer subsidies for big oil. They fought to protect the carried interest tax loophole that lets hedge fund billionaires pay lower tax rates than their chauffeurs and doormen. And they want to go after the child tax credit. They want to go after the earned income tax credit. They want to go after the college tuition tax credit. That is priorities that, like our tax code for too many Americans, are upside down. I hope that Republicans will join us tomorrow in voting to advance a measure that would keep taxes low for the vast majority of Americans, and I urge them to re-examine their proposal to raise taxes on 25 million low and middle-income Americans. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, many of our Republican colleagues argue that we cannot extend tax relief for middle-class families unless we also extend tax cuts for the wealthiest. They argue that without tax cut for that wealthiest 2%, we will harm job creators and slow the economy. Their arguments rely on faulty assumptions, mistaken beliefs, and misleading statements, and let's get to the facts. It is a fact that every American taxpayer would receive a tax cut under our bill on the first $250,000 of their income. It is a fact that, compared to the Middle Class Tax Cut Act now before us, the plan that the Republicans have put forward would increase the deficit by $155 billion. It is a fact that the bill Republicans have put forward, despite their professed support for tax cuts, would raise taxes on the middle class by failing to extend the 2009 tax cuts for middle-class families, including the American Opportunity Tax Credit and credits that help families with children. Now, Madam President, what's unfolding on the Senate floor now is the culmination of a rigid Republican adherence to tax cuts for the wealthy as the supreme goal of public policy. Republicans have demonstrated a willingness to risk government shutdowns. They've demonstrated a willingness to risk grave economic damage, to risk rising taxes on the vast majority of Americans in pursuit of their highest priority, lowest and lower taxes on the wealthiest 2% of us. They want to risk all that in service to an idea that has already proved a failure. When historians look back at the Republican dedication to tax cuts for the wealthy, they will find it remarkable that so many fought so long and so hard to go back to a failed policy. Income for the typical American family peaked in the year 2000. Not coincidentally, just before the Republican tax cuts for the wealthy mania reached its zenith. A June study by the Federal Reserve found that the average middle-class family's net worth had fallen by 40% from 2007 to 2010. And in 2010, the bottom 99% of income earners reaped just 7% of total income growth, while 93% of all growth flowed to the top 1%. As David Leonhardt of the New York Times reported on Monday, quote, the top earning 1% of households now bring home about 20% of total income, up from less than 10% 40 years ago. He continued, the top earning 1/10,000th of households, each earning at least $7.8 million a year, many of them working in finance, bring home almost 5% of the nation's income, up from 1% 40 years ago, close quote. Now, perhaps this vast accumulation of wealth would arguably be acceptable if it had resulted in faster economic growth, if it had produced new jobs and helped average Americans prosper. Indeed, since the time of President Reagan, America has been told that the rising tide lifting up the wealthy would lift all boats, that the benefits would trickle down to all Americans. And our Republican colleagues today argue that we must continue the President Bush tax cuts for the wealthy or risk harm to the, quote, job creators. But the Republican emphasis on policies that are more and more generous to the wealthiest has utterly failed to spark economic growth or create the jobs that we need. Their experiment failed. The Bush tax cuts coincided with the slowest rate of job growth in American history. Economic growth, even before the financial crisis nearly sent our economy into depression, was woefully short by historic standards. The failure of the Bush policies to spur economic growth and job creation underlies the failure of another promise from supporters of tax cuts for the wealthy, the promise that those cuts would pay for themselves. Republicans backing the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 painted those grand scenarios of growth so rapid that it would yield increased tax revenue. But instead of growing federal coffers, we got a flood of red ink. So the policy of tax cuts for the wealthy failed as a fiscal policy. It added to our deficit. It failed as an economic policy, coinciding with weak growth in economic output and job creation. And it failed as a vital test of public policy in a democratic society because it failed the fairness test. Instead, it facilitated massive accumulations of wealth for a fortunate few, while most Americans have struggled just to tread water. And yet our Republican colleagues persist in their pursuit of their failed policy, persist in fact to the point that they are willing to force a tax increase on more than 90% of taxpayers and potentially send our economy tumbling back into recession in adherence to that failed policy. Madam President, we're not arguing against this policy of tax cuts for the wealthiest because we seek to denigrate success or to stoke class warfare, as some Republicans allege. We are arguing against these policies because they are broken. They have failed. They are unfair. We should reject them lest they do even more harm. We should reject the Republican pursuit of tax cuts for the wealthy at all costs. Every other consideration be damned. We should allow middle-class families to keep a few of their hard-earned dollars and pass the Middle Class Tax Cut Act. We should, at a minimum, vote tomorrow to overcome the filibuster threat and to move to proceed to debate this singularly important issue. And, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor this afternoon to talk about a very important bill, the Violence Against Women Act. And it's hard for me to believe it has actually been months now since we first came here to the floor to talk about this important legislation, which is why we are here again this afternoon to try and pass a bill into law that has consistently received broad bipartisan approval. It's a bill that passed the Senate now almost 3 months ago by a vote of 68 to 31. Madam President, the Violence Against Women Act has successfully helped provide life-saving assistance to hundreds of thousands of women and their families. And every time we have reauthorized this bill, we include bipartisan provisions to address those that are not being protected by it. But here we are, back on the Senate floor, urging support for a bill that should not be controversial. So today, the women of the Senate and the men who support the Violence Against Women Act have come to the floor with a simple, straightforward message for our friends in the House of Representatives. Stop the games and pass the inclusive, bipartisan Senate bill without delay. And in the coming weeks, we're going to be making sure this message resonates loud and clear, both here in the nation's capital and back home in our states, because we are not going to back down. Not while there are thousands of women across our country who are currently excluded from the law. In fact, for Native and immigrant women and LGBT individuals, every moment our inclusive legislation to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act is delayed is another moment they are left without the resources and protection that they deserve. You know, the numbers really are staggering. 1 in 3 Native women will be raped in their lifetimes. 1 in 3. 2 in 5 of them are victims of domestic violence. They are killed at 10 times the rate of the national average. And these shocking statistics aren't isolated to one group of women. 25 to 35% of women in the LGBT community experience domestic violence in their relationships. And 3 in 4 abused immigrant women never entered the process to obtain legal status, even though they were eligible, because their abuser husbands never filed their paperwork. This should make it perfectly clear to our colleagues in the other chamber that their current inaction has a real impact on the lives of women across America who are affected by violence. Women like Deborah Parker. Deborah is the vice chairwoman of the Tulalip tribe in my home state of Washington. Deborah was repeatedly abused, starting at a very young age, by a non-tribal man who lived on her reservation. Not until the abuse stopped around the 4th grade did Deborah realize she wasn't the only child suffering at the hands of that assailant. At least a dozen other young girls had fallen victim to that same man. He was a man who was never arrested for his crimes, never brought to justice, and still walks free today. All because he committed these heinous acts on the reservation and as someone who's not a member of the tribe, and it's an unfortunate reality that he is unlikely to be held liable for his crimes. Madam President, reauthorizing an inclusive VAWA is a matter of fairness. Deborah's experience and the experience of other victims of this man do not represent an isolated incident. For the narrow set of domestic violence crimes laid out in the Violence Against Women Act, tribal governments should be able to hold accountable defendants that have a strong tie to the tribal community. Madam President, I was very glad to see Republican Congresswoman Judy Biggert and several of her Republican colleagues echoed these very same sentiments last week. In a letter to Speaker Boehner and Leader Cantor, the Republican members explicitly called on their party leadership to end this gridlock and accept, quote, Senate-endorsed provisions that would protect all victims of domestic violence, including college students, LGBT individuals, Native Americans, and immigrants, end quote. So today we are here to urge Speaker Boehner to listen to the members of his own caucus and join us in taking a major step to uphold our government's promise to protect its people. You know, I was so proud to have served in the Senate back in 1994 with Senator Boxer, who's here with me today, when we first passed this bill. And since we took that historic step, VAWA has a great success in coordinating victims advocates and social service providers law enforcement professionals to meet the challenges of combating domestic violence. And along with its bipartisan support, it has received praise from law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, victim service providers, faith leaders, healthcare professionals, advocates, and survivors. VAWA has attained such broad support because it works. Where a person lives, their immigration status, or who they love should not determine whether or not perpetrators of domestic violence are brought to justice. These women across this country cannot afford any further delay, not on this bill. Now, Madam President, today the New York Times ran an editorial on this bill that really gets to the heart of where we are. It began by saying, quote, House Republicans have to decide which is more important, protecting victims of domestic violence or advancing the harsh anti-gay and anti-immigrant sentiments of some on their party's far right. At the moment, harshness is winning, unquote. But the editorial pointed out it doesn't have to be that way. It pointed out, and I quote, in May, 15 Senate Republicans joined with the Chamber's Democratic majority to approve a strong reauthorization bill, unquote. And finally, it ends with what we all know it will take to move this bill forward, leadership from Congressman Boehner. And I ask unanimous consent that the letter be printed in the record.
Without objection.
So, Madam President, today the effort we are beginning here in the Senate is an effort that will continue for as long as it takes. It is a call for the same thing, leadership. It's time for Speaker Boehner to look beyond ideology and partisan politics. It's time for him to look at the history of a bill that again and again and again has been supported and expanded by Republicans and Democrats. It's time for him to do the right thing and pass our inclusive, bipartisan Violence Against Women Act, because women across the country's lives literally depend on it. Madam President, I'm delighted that my colleague from California is here with me. She's been with us every step of the way in this bipartisan bill that we've moved forward. And as women and men who support us, we are going to continue being loud and strong. We need to pass the Senate bill. Speaker Boehner needs to take it up. The women in this country are watching and waiting. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President, Senator from California.
I ask that the phone call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'm proud to follow Senator Murray in her call to pass the bipartisan Senate bill which will reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. The Leahy-Crapo bill is the only bill that will protect all the women in our country. I well remember Vice President Biden was then Senator Biden. In 1990, he wrote the Violence Against Women Act. And I was in the House at the time, and he asked if I would carry the House version of his bill. I was extremely honored to do that. And we were able to pass small portions of the bill early in the 90s. But it wasn't until I came here until the Senate that we actually passed the entire bill. And I think it was Senator Schumer, who was then in the House, that picked up the ball on the bill in the House. It got passed. And since then, we've seen a decline in violence of 53%. But even so, even while the law is working, we have to strengthen it because, Madam President, as you know, because you're a leader in this, every day 3 women are killed by their abusive partners. Let me say that again. Every single day, 3 women are killed by their abusive partners. So in order to change this terrible statistic, we need to reauthorize this Violence Against Women Act, and we need to improve it to protect more victims of domestic violence. And that's what the Senate did. I'm very proud of the Senate. We passed the bipartisan bill with a vote of 68 to 31, with 15 Republicans voting in favor. And, Madam President, you also worked hard to get the transportation bill done. And it was a very similar situation. The Senate had a bipartisan bill. It was a very popular bill. It had over 70 votes. The House was very slow to take up the measure, and we kept saying, pass the Senate bill. Finally, they passed a small bill, and we got to conference. We hammered it out. But here's the thing. We don't have time on this. We need to tell the House and ask the House to take a look at our bill and to understand how important it is that everybody be included in the Violence Against Women Act. So I'm going to put up a chart here that shows us how many people are left out of the House Violence Against Women Act. And now I would say, Mr. President, we can see that 30 million people are left out of the House Violence Against Women Act. That's why we have seen a number of colleagues in the House call for passage of a bill like the Senate's bill, because we include everybody. It isn't fair to leave entire groups out of the protections of the Violence Against Women Act, and that's exactly what they do in the House. The House bill ignores the wishes of law enforcement and excludes key protections for 4 million immigrants. It excludes 16 million LGBT persons from critical legal protections and services. More than 44% of LGBT victims who seek shelters are turned away. The House bill would also prevent Indian tribes from protecting almost 2 million Native American women from their abusers. This is outrageous. It's an extremely outrageous omission, given that nearly half of all Native American women have been victims of domestic violence. Mr. President, let me repeat that. Almost half of all Native American women have been victims of domestic violence, and yet, among the 33 million left out of the House Violence Against Women Act, you see the exclusion of the Native American community. Despite the epidemic of sexual assault and dating violence on our college campuses, the House bill leaves out improved protections for more than 11 million college women. The House bill would deny vital protections to women like an immigrant woman who is my constituent, who had been stabbed by her boyfriend 19 times while she was 3 months pregnant, Mr. President. During her ordeal, her boyfriend drove her from one part of town to the other, refusing to take her to the emergency room, even though she was losing consciousness, Mr. President, and bleeding profusely. Thankfully, the woman received medical attention. The baby was not lost, and she made a full recovery. This brave woman, despite her physical and emotional scars, fully cooperated with the police and the prosecutor to eventually bring her abuser to justice. A woman's shelter helped her get a U visa based on her cooperation with law enforcement, and she and her child were able to move on with a new life. Now, Mr. President, if you look at some of the most vulnerable people living in America today, in addition to our children, and I know what you're dealing with in Pennsylvania, with an unbelievable, horrific, violent crime that took place in a college campus over a period of years, we know that our children are vulnerable. Our immigrant women are extremely vulnerable, too, because they're scared that they're going to be kicked out of the country, and therefore their abuser knows that and puts them in a horrific situation where if they go to the police to report the abuse on themselves and their kids, they may be kicked out of the country. That's why we have the U visas, and the U visas say if you cooperate with law enforcement, you won't be kicked out. So we have to include immigrant women and, by extension, their children in the 30 million that are left out. We have to add them back in. The House bill fails to ensure that people like Jonathan, a gay man who was abused by his partner of 13 years, receive full protection under the law and cannot be discriminated against. When Jonathan did seek shelter from his abuser, he was refused by 3 L.A. area domestic violence shelters, none of which could give him a reason for excluding him. But he was left out because this community was not mentioned in the Violence Against Women Act. It is not mentioned in the House Act, and Jonathan falls among the 30 million that are left out of the House Act. The House bill also leaves out students like Mika, who was physically assaulted by her boyfriend while she was in college in San Francisco. Her ex-boyfriend broke her phone, broke into her home, stole her belongings, stalked her at school, and severely beat her. She got a restraining order against him, but struggled to get her school to enforce that restraining order. She shouldn't have had to struggle. She should have had the school on her side. Sadly, only the Senate bill would help her, not the House bill. The House bill does not protect these women. Only the Senate bill ensures that all women and LGBT individuals and college students are protected equally under the law, as well as Native American women. The consequences of denying anyone the critical protections in the Violence Against Women Act are just too great. When someone is bleeding on the floor, we need to help them in this great country. You don't want to start asking them questions. You know, are you gay? Are you straight? Are you an immigrant? Are you a college student? Are you a Native American? If someone is bleeding on the floor, we help them in this country. That's what America is about. We see the compassion and the love every day in our country, and we saw it pour out in Aurora, Colorado, for an unspeakable situation. When there is violence, we have to help the victims. And only the Senate bill, the Senate Violence Against Women Act, the Leahy-Crapo bipartisan Senate bill, affords protection to all of our people. And so what we're saying to Speaker Boehner is, please hear our plea. This isn't about the Senate saying it's any better than the House. What we are saying is, in a bipartisan way, we figured out a bill that will protect everybody. And we are asking you to pick up that bill and pass it. There's some technical issues, a blue slip question. We've studied that, and what did we find out? Those technical problems can be overcome in 5 seconds. So there's no reason why the House cannot pick up and pass the Senate bill. The safety of women across the country, the safety of all of our communities is at stake. And it's time we pass it. In closing, I would say this. Vice President Biden is a wonderful human being, and he could not sit back when he was in the Senate and see violence against women go on and on and on without any way to ensure that women could get into shelters, that women could get counseling, that law enforcement could be trained, that doctors could be trained, that nurses could be trained, and that we enhance the penalties for those who would harm another in a domestic violence situation. He had tremendous foresight. And in this bill, Senator Leahy and Senator Crapo have amazing foresight because they have strengthened this. We have cut back domestic violence by 53%, but we have a long way to go when 3 women a day are killed, Mr. President, killed by their abuser. So, again, we have a very clear message for the House. Please join hands with us. Please, with all of the politics and all of the fighting and all of the problems, there are certain times when we should just reach out to one another and protect the American people. And this is one of those times. We have the bill. It's bipartisan. It works. Please accept it, and let's get on with our work. Thank you very, very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking my colleague from California for her leadership over many, many years and her steadfast courage and vision on this issue. Likewise, my colleague from the state of Washington who spoke before her, Senator Murray, for her leadership as well, and others in this body which passed VAWA, the Senate's version of that measure, S. 1925, by an overwhelming bipartisan margin, in fact 68 to 31 back in April. This measure truly is bipartisan, and it commands overwhelming support in this body and, more importantly, across the American public. In Connecticut, I hear again and again and again from men and women, members of all communities, that the Violence Against Women Act is an idea whose time came 18 years ago, but continues to demand the kind of respect and support that the United States Senate has given it. And so now is the time for the House to adopt the Senate bill because it is more inclusive and more effective. For a bill that works, as this measure truly does, to include more potential victims, to provide more tools of enforcement, is absolutely appropriate and necessary at this point in our history. And, of course, I hear from Connecticut constituents like Hillary from Fairfield, who tells me 1 in 4 women worldwide and in the United States is at risk for violence at some point in her life. Men are at risk too, and VAWA supports provisions for men to be safe and healthy in their relationships as well. VAWA supports programs for both men and women perpetrators of abuse to get the help they need to stop the violence. And it ensures that women and their children have a safe place to go when in danger. Susan from New Haven, and I'm quoting, reauthorizing VAWA sends the message that survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking must have the tools to heal and reclaim their lives, that women and girls, our communities and our families must be safe, that the next generation must be engaged in this effort, and that the evolution of our collective thinking on how to break the cycle of violence is a national priority. To send any other message is unconscionable. Congress must act swiftly. Renew VAWA now. Renew VAWA is the message that we carry today to the House. Renew VAWA with the improvements and reforms that we have wisely adopted in this body, and continue a measure that has benefited 54,000, let me repeat that, 54,000 domestic violence victims in Connecticut alone, millions across the country, and has provided organizations in Connecticut nearly $5 million in just the last fiscal year from VAWA programs. These measures make a difference in people's lives. So often we can speak and think in this chamber without the kind of connection to individual lives where we see legislation, our acts here making a difference. This measure offers us the opportunity to make a difference by broadening and making more inclusive this measure. It makes it more effective, and I'm proud that it makes it more effective with an amendment that I offered to prevent criminals who use the Internet to intimidate, threaten, harass, and incite violence against women and children. The use of the Internet is increasingly prevalent for these kinds of crimes. The legislation that I introduced, included in the Senate's bill, enhances current law for the Internet age. That section of the bill is not in the House version. It should be. That is the reason why I am urging the House to adopt the Senate version. But it is also more inclusive in including the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered constituents that all of us have in these protections. The LGBT Americans experience domestic violence at the same rate as the general population, but they often face discrimination in accessing services. In fact, a survey found that 45% of LGBT victims were turned away when they sought help from a domestic violence shelter. There's a real need, an unquestionable and immediate need to improve the access and availability of services for LGBT victims, and our measure does it. The House version does not. Over 800 constituents, and I welcome them in contacting me, have written me to urge that we preserve the LGBT provisions of the Senate bill as VAWA moves forward. And S-1925 also includes protections for Native Americans that are absolutely vital. One of the invisible, unknown, unrealized, unacknowledged facts about this community is that nearly 3 out of 5 Native American women are assaulted by their spouses or intimate partners. 1/3 of all American Indian women will be raped during their lifetime. Those numbers alone should dictate the result. And the members of the Tribal Council of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation and others across the country, the Mashantucket Pequots happen to be from Connecticut, have appealed to me to protect the tribal provisions in the Senate measure, not to waver, not to relent to the House version. And so, again, I urge the House to adopt our measure. And protecting immigrant populations ought to be a given for the United States Senate. The House version of VAWA would endanger the safety of non-citizens and society as a whole. That is a quote from the International Institute of Connecticut, which has urged me to hold firm, to support the provisions of the Senate bill, and not surrender to the House and relent on protecting immigrants who need this help. And again, I quote, the House version would endanger, quote, endanger the safety of non-citizen victims and society as a whole. VAWA symbolizes for our immigrants, those who come to this country, what makes America great. We protect everyone who needs it. We enforce the laws equally, without discriminating against people as to their national heritage or origin or ethnicity or race or other background. Equal protection of the laws is one of the unique constitutional principles of the American democracy and the American Constitution. And our landmark measure enhances and enforces equal protection of the laws. I hope this body stands firm. I hope that the House understands that it's not about one body being better than another. We're way beyond that kind of comparison at this point. It's one version of the same legislation, one set of provisions seeking a common goal, doing it better, more inclusively, and more effectively in the great tradition of the legislative process. I urge the House of Representatives to put partisanship aside, to put aside any kind of cameral personal differences, and take immediate action to support all victims in America who are victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
The senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the need to extend the current tax rates and to reject the tens of billions of dollars in higher taxes that the President and Senate Democrats want to impose next year. I believe the upcoming vote or votes will be one of the most important votes that the Senate holds this year. As early as tomorrow, we will hopefully vote on tax plans that represent two competing philosophies. One plan introduced by Majority Leader Reid and supported by Senate Democrats and the President proposes higher taxes on American entrepreneurs, investors, and small business owners. The Democratic plan represents the philosophy that if only the government could raise enough money, that Congress could somehow spend our way to prosperity. It is a viewpoint that holds that the federal government can spend hardworking American tax dollars better than they can. Rather than leaving the money in the private economy where it can be invested or spent by private citizens, this view holds that the government should instead bring these dollars here to Washington, D.C. to redistribute them through the federal bureaucracy. This philosophy was probably best articulated by the President recently when he said, and I quote, "If you've got a business, you didn't build that. Someone else made that happen," and end quote. In other words, no one is extraordinary by virtue of their hard work and accomplishments. When someone works hard and succeeds, we shouldn't celebrate that person as an example to others. We should instead take from him or her in order, again, as the President said, to spread the wealth, to quote another of his lines. I'm hopeful that the tax and spend philosophy of the Reid tax plan, however, will not be our only option. I hope that we'll also have the opportunity to vote on legislation introduced recently by Senator Hatch and Minority Leader McConnell. This plan takes a very different approach by following the view that now is not the time to raise anyone's taxes. This view holds that our American free enterprise system works best when government gets out of the way, leaving Americans free to pursue their hopes and dreams. One way that we can leave Americans free to pursue their dreams is by not raising their taxes next year. And we especially shouldn't raise taxes when Americans are struggling to get by. Ironically, the view that we should extend current tax policy at a time when the economy is weak was articulated, interestingly enough, by the President just 2 years ago when he signed an extension of all the tax rates. At that time, President Obama said that raising taxes would have been a blow to our economy just as we're climbing out of a recession. Well, interestingly enough, at that time, real GDP growth, when he was made that statement, when that tax rate extension was signed into law, was around 3.1%. That was the average when the President made the statement that if we raised taxes, it would be a blow to our economy. Well, real GDP growth this year is on a pace to average around 2% and possibly less. Those numbers consistently are being revised and being revised downward. If it didn't make sense to raise taxes when our economy was recovering, why does it make sense now to raise taxes as our economy is slowing? How does it make sense to raise taxes in an environment where over 23 million Americans are out of work or underemployed, when the unemployment rate has been stuck over 8% now for 41 consecutive months? The votes tomorrow are incredibly important, not because either plan is likely to become law immediately, but because Americans deserve to know where their senators stand when they go to vote this November. Do you stand for stable tax rates that encourage work and investment, or do you stand for increasing taxes on the very businesses we rely on for job creation? Do you stand for a free enterprise system that rewards hard work and innovation? Or do you stand for making it more difficult for small businesses to grow and succeed? Mr. President, these are the important choices that will have real impact on hardworking Americans and on our economy at large. Consider the Reid tax plan. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, this plan will impose a tax increase on nearly 1 million business owners. Nearly 1 million business owners. Now, proponents of this increase are going to argue that it will only affect a small segment of our economy. And yet the Joint Tax Committee estimates that the tax increases in the Reid plan will hit more than 50% of all income earned by businesses that pay their taxes at individual rates. These are called pass-through businesses, and they apply to S corporations, partnerships, sole proprietorships, and LLCs. They're the ones who are going to see their cost of doing business go up next year for no other reason than the desire by the Senate Democrats to, quote, tax the rich. Small businesses, which accounted for 2/3 of the net new jobs over the last decade, will be particularly impacted by these tax increases. According to a survey of small businesses by the National Federation of Independent Business, 75% of small businesses are organized as pass-through businesses. Now, NFIB also found that the businesses most likely to be hit by the Reid tax increase are those businesses employing between 20 and 250 employees. According to the U.S. Census, the data that they collect, these businesses employ more than 25% of the workforce. And so the million small businesses that, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, will see their taxes go up under this proposal employ 25% of the American workforce and account for over 50% of all pass-through income. And so you're going to see taxes go up dramatically on over 50% of pass-through income and on small businesses that employ 25% of the American workforce. Now, does that make sense in this economy? It should be no wonder that the political party advocating this kind of tax policy has also presided, I should say, over the weakest economic recovery literally since the end of World War II. The impact of the Reid tax increases on small businesses will be bad enough. But unfortunately, these tax increases will have significant ramifications for our entire economy. According to a study released earlier this month by Ernst & Young, the Reid tax plan would hurt our economy in the long term. According to Ernst & Young, the tax increases in the Reid plan would reduce economic output by 1.3%. This would mean $200 billion less in economic activity if translated into today's economy. The Ernst & Young study estimates that the tax policies in the Reid plan would reduce employment by 0.5%, meaning roughly 710,000 fewer jobs. The study estimates that the Senate Democrat approach will reduce the nation's capital stock by 1.4% and investment by 2.4%, and that this approach will reduce after-tax wages by 1.8%. And so you're going to reduce investment, you're going to cost the economy over 700,000 jobs, you're going to reduce after-tax wages for hardworking Americans in this country, and yet here we are talking about a tax increase that would do dangerous damage and harm to our economy. And I would say, Mr. President, these aren't partisan statistics compiled by Senate Republicans. These are the estimates by a respected accounting firm as to what will happen if we follow the tax policies proposed by Senate Democrats and the President. We'll have less economic growth, fewer jobs, and a lower standard of living in the long run. These numbers simply confirm common sense. If we want individuals and businesses to spend and invest more, we shouldn't raise the amount of their income that they have to pay to the federal government. And that's what this does. We have major tax policy decisions to make, decisions reflected in the votes that we're going to take tomorrow. Do we want to encourage capital formation in this country? In other words, do we want to encourage investors to put their capital at risk so that businesses will have money to make new investments? Well, by raising the capital gains tax rate from 15% to 20% for some investors, the Reid bill will make it less attractive to invest in our economy. According to an Ernst & Young study from February of this year, the top rate of capital gains will rise to 56.7% on January 1st of next year after taking into account corporate, investor, and state taxes. This will be the second highest combined capital gains tax rate in the world among OECD and BRIC nations. America already has the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world. It appears as if the Senate Democrats are going for #1 when it comes to capital gains taxes as well. If there is anything I can say that's positive about the Democrats' tax increase plan, it is at least that they rejected the President's proposal to nearly triple the tax on dividends paid by upper-income Americans. Even Senate Democrats, who are not shy about raising taxes, understand that the President's proposal to impose a top rate of over 40% on dividend income would be terrible for millions of seniors who rely on dividend-paying stocks, and for those American companies that rely on dividends to raise capital. Instead, the Reid bill would increase the top rate on dividends from 15% to 20%. Now, I believe this tax increase is bad policy, but it won't be nearly as harmful as the President's approach would have been. On another issue of critical importance, however, the Senate Democrats have decided to run to the left of this liberal administration. And this is on the issue of the estate tax, better known as the death tax. The Reid plan would impose a huge new death tax on family farms and businesses next year. Under current law, businesses and farms are exempted from the death tax on the first $5 million of the value of an estate. Values above this amount are taxed at a top rate of 35%. Well, I believe we ought to completely eliminate the death tax, and I've introduced legislation with 37 of my colleagues to do so, but the current death tax treatment exempts the large majority of family farms and businesses from the tax. The Reid plan, however, would allow the death tax to revert to the provisions in effect before 2001. This means that under the Reid plan, family farms and businesses will face a top death tax rate of 55% on estates above $1 million in value. This is a massive death tax increase on tens of thousands of small businesses and family farms across America. In fact, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Reid plan will increase the number of estates subject to the death tax in 2013 from 3,600 estates under current law to 50,300 estates under Reid's proposal. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Reid plan will subject 20 times more farming estates to the death tax in 2013, a 2,000% increase. The Reid plan will subject 9 times more small businesses to the death tax, a 900% increase. If the death tax policy and the Reid plan were made permanent over the next 10 years, the number of small businesses subject to the death tax would increase from 1,800 to 23,700, and the number of family farms subject to the death tax would increase from 900 to 25,200. That's all data put together and reported out by the Joint Committee on Taxation. The reason for this massive expansion of the death tax is because the $1 million exemption amount is much too low, given the value of successful farms and small businesses today. And I'll use my state of South Dakota as a good example. If you take family farms in South Dakota, according to the Department of Agriculture, the average size of a farm in my state is 1,374 acres. And according to the USDA, the average value per acre of cropland in South Dakota is about $1,800. This means that the average value of a farm in my state is nearly $2.5 million. And so if you have a death tax law that only exempts $1 million and has a 55% top rate on everything above that, imagine what that's going to do to the average farm in a state like South Dakota. And South Dakota is not unique in that regard. We've seen land values rise across America's heartland, from Nebraska to Missouri to Montana. Let's be clear. The Reid bill would subject many more families to a punitive double tax, the death tax, when a loved one passes away. It will make it much more difficult to pass family farms and businesses from one generation to the next. And we should never forget that most family farms are land rich and cash poor. Lots of assets, land values, those sorts of things. What you don't want to see happen, Mr. President, is to see a family farm that could be passed on to the next generation have to be liquidated to pay the IRS because of a punitive death tax. And is it precisely what this policy as proposed by the Democrat plan would do? The USDA estimates that 84% of farm assets are comprised of farm real estate. That's where most farm and ranch families have their assets. That means that family farms don't have extra cash on hand to pay the death tax. Instead, they'll have to sell off land or take on additional debt in order to pay these higher taxes. Mr. President, that is exactly what we don't want to see happen in this country. I don't believe that the President's proposal, which is a $3.5 million exemption and a 45% top rate, is adequate, but it is much better than what the Senate Democrats and the Reid plan have proposed. And so let me just summarize, if I might. Tomorrow we're going to vote on the Reid proposal to raise taxes at a time when Americans are hurting and our economy is fragile. The Reid proposal is going to impose higher taxes of more than $50 billion on successful small business owners and families. It will hurt our economy, reducing economic growth and job creation. At the same time, it lowers wages for hardworking American families. And it will impose a new death tax of $31 billion on 43,100 family farmers, ranchers, and small businesses. We will also vote, I hope, Mr. President, on the Hatch-McConnell alternative plan to keep tax rates where they are to prevent a tax increase on any American next year. In addition to keeping tax rates where they are, the Hatch-McConnell proposal provides instructions to the Finance Committee to report out fundamental tax reform legislation by 12 months from the date of enactment of the bill. The Hatch-McConnell approach is the correct approach. Prevent a tax increase now and move to fundamental tax reform next year. Of course, extending current tax law temporarily is only a short-term fix. What is really needed is comprehensive tax reform, much like the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Real tax reform will drive economic growth higher, will lead to robust job creation, and will result in more revenue to the federal government. But real tax reform is going to require presidential leadership, something that has unfortunately been lacking over the past 3.5 years. Perhaps next year we'll have a president truly willing to commit to tax reform, a president who is not content with simply releasing a 23-page framework for corporate tax reform. But until we get to comprehensive tax reform, Mr. President, the least we can do now is to ensure that Americans do not face a massive new tax hike during the weak economy. I hope we will get that vote tomorrow. I hope that, that the Senate Democrats will find their way to give us a vote on extending the tax rates for all Americans so that small businesses aren't whacked with a big tax increase next year, so that our economy doesn't get plunged perhaps into a recession. We don't see that unemployment rate tick even higher. Those are the results. Those are the outcomes. Those are the types of things that are going to happen, according to all the independent analysis of the tax proposal that is before us today. And remember, there's always this idea that somehow if we raise more taxes that we'll be able to pay down more of the debt. And I got to say, Mr. President, I've not been my experience around here that when there's money around Washington, D.C., it gets sucked up and it gets spent. And I think a lot of Americans would welcome the idea of seeing their taxes going to pay down the debt. But you're going to see a massive tax increase on Americans that is going to be used to grow government here in Washington, D.C. And that is not what the American people want, and that is not what we in the United States Senate should be for. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the following staff of the Finance Committee be allowed Senate floor during consideration